Thomas had always been a man of few words. At 52, he ran the Double M Ranch in rural Arizona with the same quiet determination his father had shown before him. The sprawling property stretched across 3,000 acres of desert landscape, home to nearly 800 head of cattle and a handful of quarter horses that had been in his family for generations. The ranch house sat like a weathered sentinel against the backdrop of red mesas and endless sky. Built in the 1940s by his grandfather, it was a sturdy structure of adobe and timber that had withstood decades of scorching summers and bitter winters. Inside, the rooms echoed with memories of a time when the house had been filled with laughter and conversation. Now, it felt more like a museum than a home. Thomas lived alone, had done so for the past 8 years since his wife passed away from cancer. The silence that had settled over the house was broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant lowing of cattle. He preferred it that way, or so he told himself. People were complicated. Cattle were straightforward. You fed them, watered them, doctored them when they were sick, and they provided for you in return. It was an honest arrangement. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Up at 4:30, coffee black and strong, then out to check on the herd before the Arizona heat became unbearable. He employed 6 ranch hands who knew their jobs well enough to work without much supervision. Santos had been his foreman for 15 years and could practically run the place blindfolded. The other men were good workers, too, mostly local guys who understood ranch life and respected Thomas's preference for minimal conversation. The kitchen had become Thomas's least favorite room in the house. It held too many memories of cooking, her humming while she prepared meals, the way she could make even the simplest dishes taste like something special. Since her death, he'd survived on a rotation of canned soup, frozen dinners, and whatever the diner in town could provide when he made his weekly trips for supplies. The once warm heart of the home now felt cold and abandoned. It was who finally brought up what everyone had been thinking, but nobody had dared to say. They were standing by the water trough, watching the morning sun paint the distant mountains gold, when the foreman cleared his throat in that way that meant he had something important to discuss. "Boss," began, his weathered hands working nervously at the brim of his hat. "The boys and I, we've been talking. We're worried about you." Thomas continued watching the cattle, his expression unchanged. "Nothing to worry about." "With respect, sir, there is. You're losing weight. That jacket of yours is hanging loose as a scarecrow's shirt. And when's the last time you had a proper meal? I mean a real meal, not something heated up in a microwave." The comment stung because Thomas knew it was true. He'd noticed his clothes fitting differently, had seen the concerned looks from the ranch hands when they thought he wasn't paying attention. But acknowledging the problem meant facing truths he wasn't ready to confront. "I get by just fine," Thomas replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Shook his head. "Wouldn't want this for you, boss. You know that as well as I do." The mention of his wife's name hit harder than Thomas expected. Had always believed that food was love made tangible, that gathering around a table was how families stayed connected. She would indeed be disappointed to see what he'd let himself become. "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Hire someone to cook. Keep house a little. Nothing fancy, just someone to make sure you're eating proper food and the place doesn't fall apart around you." The idea of having a stranger in his house, in his kitchen, felt like a betrayal. But as he looked down at his hands, he noticed how bony they'd become, how his wedding ring now slipped around his finger where once it had fit snugly. Maybe had a point. "I don't know any housekeepers," Thomas admitted. "My cousin Maria, she cleans houses in Phoenix. She knows people, good people, honest workers who know how to respect a man's privacy." Thomas considered this for a long moment. The thought of interviewing potential employees, of explaining his situation to strangers, made him uncomfortable. But the alternative was continuing down a path that seemed to lead nowhere good. "Have her ask around," he said finally. "But I want someone who understands this is a working ranch, not some fancy hotel, and I won't have anyone trying to reorganize my life or tell me how things should be done." Nodded relief evident on his weathered face. "I'll call Maria tonight." 3 days later, Maria Santos arrived at the ranch with news. She'd found someone interested in the position, though she warned that the candidate was a bit different from what Thomas might expect. "She's Navajo," Maria explained as they sat in Thomas's sparse living room. "Lives on the reservation about 40 miles north, Lost her job at the casino when they downsized last month. She's got experience cooking for large groups, keeps a clean house, and she's looking for steady work. Thomas frowned. He'd had limited interactions with the Native American community, though he knew several Navajo families lived and worked in the area. His concerns weren't about ethnicity, but about privacy. She understand this is a quiet place. I'm not looking for someone who wants to chat all day. It's probably quieter than you are, Maria laughed. She's got her own reasons for preferring to keep to herself. She's been through some hard times lately. The way Maria said it suggested there was more to the story, but Thomas didn't pry. Everyone had their burdens to carry, and he respected people who chose to carry them privately. When can she start? She can come by tomorrow for an interview if that works for you. But I should mention, she doesn't drive. Her grandson usually brings her places, or she takes the tribal bus when it's running. Transportation could be an issue, but Thomas found himself intrigued despite his reservations. There was something to be said for hearing someone who needed the job as much as he needed the help. The next morning, Thomas found himself packing around the kitchen, unsure why he felt nervous about a simple job interview. He'd hired dozens of ranch hands over the years without giving it much thought. But somehow this felt different, more personal. This person would be working in his home, in the spaces where he tried to maintain what little remained of his old life. At exactly 10 o'clock, he heard the rumble of an old pickup truck coming up the dusty drive. Through the kitchen window, he watched as a beat-up Ford pulled to a stop near the front porch. A young man got out first, maybe 20 years old, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for a woman who appeared to be in her 50s. Begay moved with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to observing before acting. She was shorter than Thomas had expected, with graying black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a clean but faded denim shirt and dark pants, carrying herself with a dignity that impressed Thomas immediately. The young man who'd driven her hung back by the truck while approached the front door. Thomas opened it before she could knock, and they stood for a moment studying each other in the morning light. "Mr. I'm Begay. Maria Santos said you might have worked for someone like me." Her voice was soft but clear, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of a first language other than English. There was no nervousness in her manner, no eagerness to please that Thomas had seen in other job candidates. She simply waited, patient and self-possessed. "Come in," Thomas said, stepping aside. "We can talk in the kitchen." As they walked through the house, Thomas noticed how eyes moved around the rooms, not with curiosity but with the practiced assessment of someone who understood how to care for a home. When they reached the kitchen, she paused for just a moment, taking in the outdated appliances, the empty countertops, and the general air of abandonment that hung over the space. "This is a good kitchen," she said simply. "Just needs some attention." They sat across from each other at the small table where Thomas had shared countless meals with. The contrast wasn't lost on him, where his wife had filled silence with gentle chatter, seemed completely comfortable with quiet. "Maria probably told you what I'm looking for," Thomas began. "Someone to cook meals, keep the house in order, nothing fancy. I'm not home much during the day, so mostly it would be dinner and making sure the place doesn't fall apart." Nodded. "What kind of food do you like?" The question caught him off guard. Most job interviews focused on experience and references. Was asking about his preferences, as if the job were already hers and she was simply gathering information to do it well. "Simple food," he replied. "Meat and potatoes, nothing too spicy or complicated." "I can cook simple food," said. "I can also cook other things if you ever want to try something different." There was no sales pitch in her tone, no attempt to oversell her abilities. She was simply stating facts, and Thomas found this approach refreshing. "Maria mentioned you worked at the casino." "Kitchen supervisor for 3 years. Before that, I cooked for my family. My husband died 5 years ago and my daughter moved to California with her kids, so it's just me and my grandson now." The way she spoke about her losses was matter-of-fact, without self-pity or drama. Thomas recognized the tone of someone who had learned to accept life's hardships without complaint. "The position would be Monday through Friday," Thomas continued. 8 hours a day, though the schedule could be flexible depending on what needs doing. I'd pay $15 an hour to start, plus I could provide transportation if that's an issue. "Considered this, what time would you want dinner?" 6:30 usually, sometimes later if we're working cattle. And breakfast? Thomas hesitated. He hadn't really thought about breakfast beyond grabbing coffee and maybe a piece of toast. I'm usually up pretty early, around 5. I could come at 4:30, have coffee and breakfast ready when you get up. Leave after dinner and clean up unless you need something else. The offer was more than Thomas had expected, but something in his manner suggested it wasn't charity or eagerness to please. It was simply how she approached work, completely and competently. That might work, he said slowly. When could you start? Tomorrow if you want. Thomas studied her face, looking for some sign of uncertainty or second thoughts, but found none. Begay sat calmly at his table, waiting for his decision with the patience of someone accustomed to letting others set the pace. All right, he said finally, tomorrow it is. They spent a few more minutes working out practical details. Would need a key to the house, access to grocery money, and clear instructions about any foods Thomas couldn't or wouldn't eat. The conversation was businesslike and brief, both of them seeming to prefer efficiency over small talk. As Thomas walked her to the door, paused on the front porch and looked out over the ranch. The view from there took in the barn, the pastures where cattle grazed in whatever shade they could find, and the endless expanse of desert that stretched toward the mountains. It's peaceful here, she observed. That's the idea, Thomas replied. His grandson had been waiting patiently by the truck, and as they drove away, Thomas found himself wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. He'd hired employees before, but always men who worked outside, who he could supervise from a distance. Having someone in his house cooking his meals would require a level of trust he hadn't extended to anyone since death. That evening, as he heated up another frozen dinner, Thomas tried to remember the last time he'd looked forward to a home-cooked meal. The anticipation felt strange, almost like guilt. It seemed wrong to be excited about something that didn't involve his wife's cooking. But as he looked around the empty kitchen, he had to admit that had been right. Wouldn't want him living this way, slowly fatting away in a house that had once been full of life. Maybe it was time to let someone else bring a little warmth back to the place, even if it could never be quite the same. The next morning, Thomas woke to the smell of coffee brewing and bacon frying. For a moment, still caught between sleep and consciousness, he thought he was dreaming. The sounds and smells were so familiar, so reminiscent of mornings from his past, that he had to remind himself that was starting work today. When he made his way to the kitchen, he found her moving quietly around the space, as comfortable as if she'd been working there for years. She'd somehow managed to make the room feel more alive without changing anything obvious. Maybe it was just the presence of someone who understood how a kitchen was supposed to function. "Morning, mister," said without turning from the stove. "Coffee's ready. Breakfast will be done in about 5 minutes." Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee and took a sip. It was perfect, strong enough to wake him up but not bitter. He couldn't remember the last time someone had made coffee for him. "Just Thomas is fine," he said. Nodded, plating eggs, bacon, and toast with practiced efficiency. She set the plate in front of him along with a small glass of orange juice he didn't remember having in the house. "I brought a few things to get started," she explained, as if reading his mind. "I'll make a proper grocery list after I see what you have." The breakfast was simple but perfectly prepared. The eggs were cooked exactly right, the bacon crispy but not overdone, the toast golden brown. It was the kind of meal used to make, the kind Thomas hadn't realized how much he'd missed. They ate in comfortable silence, with her own plate at the other end of the table. She seemed content to let Thomas wake up gradually, not pushing conversation or asking unnecessary questions. It was exactly the kind of quiet morning routine he could get used to. When Thomas finished eating and headed out to begin his day, was already clearing the table and planning her approach to the rest of the house. He paused at the door, wanting to say something about the meal, about his appreciation, but the words felt awkward in his mouth. "That was good," he managed finally. Looked up from loading the dishwasher and smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "See you at dinner, Thomas." As Thomas walked toward the barn, he realized that for the first time in months, he was actually looking forward to coming home. The rhythm of having in the house established itself more quickly than Thomas had expected. Each morning, he woke to the scent of coffee and the quiet sounds of someone who knew how to move efficiently through a kitchen. She was always there before he got up, and dinner was ready when he came in from the fields, but somehow the house still felt like his own. Had a gift for being present without being intrusive. She went about her work with a quiet competence that reminded Thomas of the way his grandfather used to handle horses, firm but gentle, confident without being pushy. The house began to smell like a home again, filled with the aromas of bread baking and stews simmering slowly throughout the day. By the end of the first week, Thomas noticed changes beyond just the meals. The windows sparkled in a way they hadn't for years. The floors gleamed with a proper polish rather than just a quick mopping. Fresh flowers appeared on the kitchen table. Wildflowers had gathered from along the ranch roads, arranged simply in an old mason jar she'd found in a cupboard. But it was the small touches that affected Thomas most. Had noticed that he favored his left knee, and without being asked, she'd moved a cushion to his usual chair that provided just the right amount of support. She'd observed that he read the livestock reports every morning with breakfast, so she started setting them out beside his plate along with his reading glasses, which she somehow always managed to find wherever he'd left them the night before. The cowboys who worked the ranch began to notice changes too, though they were careful not to comment directly. However, wasn't quite as diplomatic as the others. "You're looking better, boss," he observed one afternoon as they were checking fence lines in the south pasture. "Got some color back in your face." Thomas grunted noncommittally, but he knew was right. The regular meals and quiet insistence that he sit down to eat them had already begun to show results. His clothes were starting to fit better, and he found himself with more energy for the physical demands of ranch work. "That lady, she's working out good," continued. "She does her job," Thomas replied, which in his vocabulary was high praise. "Says she saw her at the grocery store yesterday, buying ingredients for something special. Says she was real particular about picking out the best vegetables." Thomas hadn't thought to ask what was planning for dinner that night, but when he came in from the evening chores, he found the kitchen filled with unfamiliar but appealing smells. Was stirring something in a large pot that looked like nothing he'd eaten before. "Trying something new tonight," said when she noticed him looking. "My grandmother's recipe for, if you don't like it, I've got some steaks in the refrigerator I can fix instead." Thomas was about to say he'd prefer the steak. Change made him uncomfortable, and he'd specifically asked for simple food. But something in's manner stopped him. There was no pushiness in her offer, just the quiet confidence of someone sharing something they valued. "What's in it?" he asked instead. "Pork hominy, red chilies, some other things. It's comfort food where I come from." The word comfort struck Thomas as appropriate. Everything prepared seemed designed not just to fill his stomach, but to provide some deeper satisfaction he'd almost forgotten existed. When she served Thomas approached it cautiously. The first spoonful was a revelation, complex flavors that somehow worked together perfectly, warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, and a richness that came from ingredients he couldn't identify but somehow trusted completely. "This is good," he said and meant it. Smiled the same small, genuine expression he'd seen that first morning. "My grandmother always said that food cooked with good intentions tastes different." It was the most personal thing she'd said since starting work, and Thomas found himself curious about her family, her background, the traditions that had shaped the woman now sitting across his table. But he didn't ask. Like him, seemed to prefer showing rather than telling, expressing herself through actions rather than words. As the days passed, Thomas began to anticipate these small culinary adventures. Had a way of introducing new flavors gradually, always offering alternatives, but somehow making him want to try whatever she'd prepared. One evening it was green chili enchiladas that made his eyes water but left him asking for seconds. Another night, she served traditional fry bread alongside a simple beef stew, and Thomas found himself soaking up every drop of sauce with the dense, satisfying bread. But it wasn't just the food that was changing the atmosphere of the house. Brought with her a sense of order and purpose that went beyond simple housekeeping. She seemed to understand instinctively which of things Thomas wanted left untouched and which areas were ready for gentle renewal. The result was a home that honored its past while slowly coming back to life. One afternoon, Thomas came in early from the fields to find in the living room, carefully dusting the family photographs that lined the mantelpiece. She was taking special care with a wedding picture of Thomas and using a soft cloth to clean the glass and straightening the frame just so. "She was beautiful," said softly when she noticed him watching. Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "She was." How long were you married? 24 years. The words came out easier than he'd expected. Cancer got her, fought it for 2 years, but set the photograph back in its place and turned to face him. My husband died of diabetes complications, went into a coma one night and never woke up. Samuel and I were married for 18 years. It was the first time either of them had spoken directly about their losses, and Thomas was surprised by how natural it felt. There was no awkward sympathy no attempt to compare their griefs or offer empty platitudes. Just the simple acknowledgement that they had both loved and lost, both learned to carry on alone. It's hard, Thomas said finally. Yes, agreed, but it gets different, not easier exactly, but different. That evening prepared a meal that reminded Thomas powerfully of his childhood, pot roast with vegetables cooked slowly until everything was tender and flavorful, exactly the way his mother had made it. As they ate, he found himself talking more than usual, sharing stories about the ranch's history, his family's connection to the land, the challenges of modern ranching in an increasingly uncertain world. Listened with the kind of attention Thomas hadn't experienced in years. She asked thoughtful questions, offered observations that showed she understood the complexity of his relationship with the land and the life he'd built there. When he mentioned some of his concerns about the ranch's future, she didn't offer quick solutions or false reassurance, but her presence somehow made the problems feel more manageable. After dinner, as was cleaning up, Thomas found himself reluctant to retreat to his usual evening routine of watching television alone in the living room. Instead, he lingered in the kitchen, ostensibly reading through some cattle breeding journals, but really just enjoying the comfortable domestic atmosphere had created. You don't have to stay, said, glancing up from loading the dishwasher. I know you like your quiet time. Don't mind the company, Thomas replied, surprising himself with the admission. Finished her cleanup and poured herself a cup of coffee, settling at the table with what looked like a well-worn paperback book. Thomas noticed it was a mystery novel, and when she saw him looking, she smiled. I go through about 3 of these a week, she said. My grandson thinks I'm addicted to murder stories. Your grandson, he's the one who drives you here. Joseph, he's 22, works construction when he can get it. Good boy, but he worries too much about his old grandmother. There was affection in his voice when she spoke about Joseph, and Thomas could hear the love between them despite the generation gap. It reminded him of his own relationship with his grandfather, the man who'd taught him most of what he knew about ranching and life. What does he think about you working here? Was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. He was concerned at first, thought maybe I should stay closer to home, work for people we know better. But Joseph understands that sometimes you need to start over somewhere new with people who don't know all your business. The comment hinted at complications in his past, but Thomas didn't pry. He was learning that shared information when she was ready, much like himself, and he respected the pace she set for their growing friendship. As the evening wore on, they settled into a comfortable rhythm of shared silence broken by occasional conversation. Read her mystery novel while Thomas went through his journals, but there was an easy companionship in the kitchen that felt natural rather than forced. When finally gathered her things to leave, Thomas walked her to the door as had become their custom. Joseph was always punctual, arriving at exactly 9 o'clock to drive his grandmother home. Thank you for dinner, Thomas said, as he did every evening. See you tomorrow morning, replied as she did every evening. But tonight Thomas found himself adding, that recipe, think you could teach me to make it sometime. Paused in putting on her light jacket, a look of surprise crossing her features. You want to learn to cook? Maybe, might be good to know how to make something besides scrambled eggs. I'd be happy to teach you, said, and her smile was warmer than Thomas had seen before. Cooking is better when it's shared. As he watched the taillights of Joseph's truck disappear down the dusty road, Thomas realized that for the first time since death, he wasn't dreading the empty house. The kitchen still smelled like cooking, still held the warmth of their conversation, and he found himself already looking forward to tomorrow morning's coffee and whatever new surprise she might have in store. The changes in his daily routine were subtle but significant. Where once he'd hurried through meals or skipped them entirely, now he found himself savoring both the food and the quiet companionship provided. Where once the evening hours had stretched endlessly before him, now they felt too short, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silence. But perhaps the most important change was one Thomas couldn't quite put into words. For the first time in years, his house felt like a home again, not a shrine to the past, but a living space where two people who understood loss and solitude could find unexpected comfort in shared meals and quiet understanding. The week had indeed changed everything, though not in the dramatic way Thomas might have expected. Instead, had brought a gentle transformation that honored what had been while making room for what could be. And as Thomas settled into bed that night, he realized he was no longer afraid of whatever changes might come tomorrow. The second week brought new challenges that tested the growing comfort between Thomas and a late spring storm rolled across the desert, bringing with it torrential rains that turned the usually dry arroyos into rushing streams and made many of the ranch roads impassable. Thomas found himself trapped in the house for the better part of 3 days, something that would have driven him to distraction just a month earlier. Instead, he discovered an unexpected pleasure in watching adapt to the changed circumstances. When she arrived on Monday morning to find the main road washed out, she'd had Joseph drop her off at the highway and walk the final 2 miles through mud and standing water, arriving only slightly late and completely matter-of-fact about the inconvenience. "Roads are bad," she announced, shaking rainwater from her jacket. "Joseph will pick me up at the highway when I'm done tonight." Thomas started to object. The walk back would be difficult in the dark, and he had a perfectly good truck that could navigate the rougher terrain, but was already moving around the kitchen, starting coffee and planning breakfast as if walking 2 miles through a storm was just another part of her day. "I can drive you to the highway later," Thomas offered. "That would be nice," replied, accepting the help without making a big deal of it. The storm kept them both inside more than usual. Thomas found himself working on paperwork at the kitchen table while went about her tasks, and their conversations naturally became longer and more personal. He learned that had grown up on the reservation in a traditional family where her grandmother had been the keeper of old stories and recipes. She'd married young, moved away for a while, then returned home when her husband became ill. "Traditional ways and modern life don't always fit together easily," observed one afternoon as she prepared what she called comfort soup, from ingredients that seemed impossibly simple, yet somehow created something magical. "How do you mean?" Thomas asked, looking up from a stack of feed bills. "My grandmother taught me to cook by feel, by season, by what the land provided. But working in restaurant kitchens, you have to measure everything, follow recipes exactly, serve the same thing the same way every time. It took me years to figure out how to do both." Thomas understood the concept better than might have expected. Ranching had faced similar pressures, old methods that had worked for generations suddenly competing with modern techniques, scientific approaches, and corporate efficiency demands. "My grandfather never wrote down a thing about running cattle," Thomas shared. "Said it was all in watching the animals, reading the weather, knowing your land. Drove my father crazy when he was trying to learn the business." "Did you learn from your grandfather or your father?" "Both, I guess. Grandfather taught me to watch and listen. Father taught me to keep records and plan ahead. Turned out I needed all of it." Nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to say that wisdom comes from knowing when to hold on to the old ways and when to let them grow into something new." The conversation stayed with Thomas throughout the day. That evening, as they shared another meal that somehow managed to be both familiar and surprising, he found himself thinking about the changes had brought to his life. She hadn't pushed him to abandon his routines or his grief, but she'd shown him possibilities he hadn't considered. On Tuesday, with the storm still raging outside, asked if she could explore the rest of the house. "I've been working mostly in the kitchen and main rooms," she explained. "But if you want me to help take care of the whole place, I should know what needs attention." Thomas hesitated. There were rooms in the house he hadn't entered since death, spaces that still held too many memories for him to face alone. But something in its matter-of-fact tone made the prospect seem less daunting. "All right," he said, "just some of the rooms haven't been used much lately." His tour of the house was methodical and respectful. She opened doors carefully, as if entering sacred spaces, and Thomas found himself following her, seeing his own home through fresh eyes. Sewing room had become dusty and sad, filled with half-finished projects and dreams interrupted by illness. The guest room that had once hosted visiting relatives now felt more like a museum display, but didn't suggest dramatic changes or immediate action. Instead, she simply observed, occasionally asking gentle questions about the purpose of certain items or the history of particular rooms. "This was space?" she asked, standing in the sewing room doorway. "She loved to quilt," Thomas replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Had a talent for colors, for making patterns that somehow worked even when they shouldn't have." Stepped into the room and examined one of the unfinished quilts draped over a chair. The design was intricate, a star pattern in blues and greens that seemed to capture the changing colors of the desert sky. "Beautiful work," said softly. "She had good hands." "Yeah, she did." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before asked, "Would you want me to clean this room, or would you prefer to leave it as it is?" The question was exactly what Thomas needed to hear. No assumptions, no pressure, just a simple acknowledgement that the choice was his to make. "Maybe just dust it," he said finally. "Keep it from getting worse, but don't change anything." "Of course." That afternoon, while the rain continued to pound against the windows, worked quietly in sewing room. Thomas could hear her moving around, the soft sounds of careful cleaning, but when he passed by later, everything looked exactly as it had before, just cleaner and somehow more peaceful. By Wednesday, the storm had passed, but its effects lingered. Several sections of fence had been damaged by fallen tree branches, and Thomas needed to ride out with to assess what repairs would be needed. He hesitated to leave alone for the extended day the inspection would require. "Go do your work," said when she noticed his uncertainty. "House will still be here when you get back. Might be late getting in, lot of fence to check. I'll make something that keeps well, don't worry about me." Thomas saddled his horse and rode out with just after sunrise, but throughout the day he found his thoughts returning to the house, to the strange comfort of knowing someone was there waiting for his return. It wasn't the same as the feeling he'd had with, that sense of being part of a complete unit, two people building a life together. This was something different, perhaps simpler, but no less valuable. The fence damage was worse than they'd expected, and by the time Thomas returned to the house, the sun was already setting. He was tired, muddy, and frustrated by the scope of repairs that would be needed. But as he approached the back door, he caught the scent of something wonderful cooking, saw warm light spilling from the kitchen windows, and felt his tension begin to ease. Had indeed prepared something that kept well, a hearty stew that had been simmering slowly all day, developing rich flavors and filling the house with a kind of aroma that spoke of home and comfort. But more than the meal itself, it was presence that provided the deepest satisfaction. She listened without judgment as Thomas described the day's discoveries, asked practical questions about the repair timeline, and somehow made him feel that his problems were manageable rather than overwhelming. "Thinks we can get most of it fixed in a week if the weather holds," Thomas concluded, accepting a second bowl of stew without being asked. "Spring storms are hard on everything," observed. "But they also bring renewal. My grandmother used to say that the earth needs to be broken sometimes before it can grow something new." The comment seemed to carry deeper meaning than just agricultural wisdom, and Thomas found himself considering his own life in those terms. Had he been too afraid of being broken again to allow for the possibility of growth? That evening, after had gone home and Thomas was alone with his thoughts, he walked through the house with new awareness. The changes it made were subtle but significant. The rooms felt lived in rather than abandoned, cared for rather than simply maintained. Even sewing room, which he'd visited briefly after cleaning, felt more like a loving memorial than a painful reminder. But the most important change was in Thomas himself. For the first time since death, he was beginning to remember what it felt like to share his daily life with someone who cared about his. Not in the romantic way he'd shared with his wife, but in the quieter way of friendship, mutual respect, and genuine concern. The realization brought both comfort and uncertainty. Comfort because he was rediscovering that connection was possible even after devastating loss. Uncertainty because he wasn't sure what this new relationship meant or where it might lead. Thursday brought clear skies and the beginning of fence repairs. Thomas threw himself into the physical work with renewed energy, partly because the job needed doing, and partly because the manual labor helped him process the emotional discoveries of the past few days. Working alongside him, noticed the change in his boss's demeanor. "You seem different lately," the foreman observed as they stretched new wire between posts. "More like your old self." "How do you mean?" "Engaged, I guess, like you're thinking about more than just getting through the day." Was right, Thomas realized. For months after his death, he'd been operating on autopilot, going through the motions of living without really participating in life. His presence had somehow reminded him that existence could include pleasure, comfort, and even anticipation. That evening, as they shared another expertly prepared meal, Thomas brought up something that had been on his mind. "Can I ask you something personal?" She nodded, setting down her fork and giving him her full attention. "When you lost your husband, how long did it take before you felt like yourself again?" Was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "I'm not sure I ever felt like my old self again," she said finally. "But after maybe 2 years, I started feeling like a new version of myself, someone who carried Sam's memory but wasn't defined only by his absence." "Do you think that's enough, being a new version of yourself?" "I think it's everything," replied with quiet conviction. "The person I was before Sam died, she was only half formed. Losing him hurt more than I thought I could survive, but it also taught me things about strength and independence I never would have learned otherwise." Thomas absorbed this wisdom, recognizing its truth in his own experience. The man he'd been with had been content, secure, perhaps a little complacent in his happiness. The man he was becoming might be more tested, more aware of life's fragility, but also more appreciative of unexpected gifts like friendship and shared meals and the simple comfort of not being alone. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For helping me remember that being different doesn't have to mean being diminished." Smile was warm and understanding. "You would have figured that out eventually. Sometimes it just helps to have company while you're learning." As they finished dinner and prepared to leave for the day, Thomas realized that the storm had done more than just damage his fences. It had also washed away some of his resistance to change, to possibility, to the idea that his life might still hold surprises worth experiencing. The third week was about to begin, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Thomas found himself curious about what it might bring rather than simply hopping to get through it. Had given him that gift without even trying. The return of anticipation, of engagement, of hope that tomorrow might offer something better than yesterday. Standing at his kitchen window and watching the taillights of Joseph's truck disappear into the desert darkness, Thomas no longer felt like a man waiting for his life to be over. Instead, he felt like someone on the edge of a new beginning, uncertain but unafraid of whatever changes lay ahead. 3 weeks after began working at the Double M Ranch, Thomas found himself facing an unexpected crisis that would test everything their growing friendship had built. It started on a Monday morning when didn't arrive at her usual time. By 5:15, Thomas began to worry. Was never late, never failed to call if something prevented her from coming to work. At 6 o'clock, when there was still no word, Thomas drove to the highway where Joseph usually dropped his grandmother off. He found Joseph's truck broken down on the shoulder, steam rising from under the hood, and the young man standing helplessly beside it. "Mister," Joseph said, relief evident in his voice. "I was trying to figure out how to get word to you. Truck overheated about 2 miles back. Grandmother insisted on walking to your place, said she couldn't leave you without breakfast." Thomas felt a spike of alarm. Walking 2 miles in the growing heat of the desert morning at her age seemed dangerous and unnecessary. Which way did she go? Joseph pointed toward a dirt road that led through rougher terrain, but was more direct than the paved highway route. "I tried to talk her out of it, but you know how she is when she makes up her mind." Thomas did indeed know. His quiet determination was one of the qualities he'd come to respect about her, but it was also potentially dangerous in this situation. He left Joseph with his broken-down truck and drove toward the ranch, scanning the roadside for any sign of. He found her about a mile from the house, walking steadily but clearly struggling with the heat and exertion. Her face was flushed, and she was breathing heavily, but she waved off his immediate concern with characteristic stubbornness. "I'm fine," she insisted as Thomas helped her into the air-conditioned truck. "Just a little warm." "You can't walk 2 miles in this heat. Why didn't you just call? I would have come to get you." "Didn't want to be a bother. You have work to do." Thomas drove toward the house in frustrated silence. He was beginning to understand that independence wasn't just a personality trait, but a survival mechanism developed over years of handling difficulties largely on her own. But her determination to avoid being a burden was now putting her health at risk. Back at the ranch house, Thomas insisted that sit down and drink water while he called to arrange a ride for Joseph and his broken truck. Accepted the help reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with being the focus of so much attention and concern. "This is exactly why Joseph didn't want me taking this job," she said quietly, as Thomas brought her a glass of cold water. "He said I was too old to be reliable, that you'd end up having to take care of me instead of the other way around." The comment stung because Thomas could hear the hurt beneath's matter-of-fact tone. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, trying to find the right words to address fears that were clearly deeper than just this morning's incident. "How long have we been working together?" 3 weeks. "And in those 3 weeks, how many times have you been unreliable?" "Considered this? None, I guess." "Right, none. This morning wasn't about being unreliable. It was about your grandson's truck breaking down and you doing whatever it took to get to work anyway. That's not a problem, that's dedication." But Thomas could see that his reassurance wasn't entirely convincing of her value. She was still worried about being seen as a burden, still fighting against the vulnerability that came with needing help occasionally. "Tell you what," Thomas continued. "Why don't I start picking you up in the mornings and taking you home in the evenings? That way, we don't have to depend on Joseph's truck, and you don't have to worry about getting here." Shook her head immediately. "That's too much trouble. You shouldn't have to be driving back and forth because of me." "It's not trouble, it's practical. And honestly, I've been thinking it might be nice to have someone to talk to during the drive." This was only partially true. Thomas had been content with his solitary drives to town when necessary, but he found himself genuinely interested in extending his time with. Their conversations had become one of the unexpected pleasures of his day. Studied his face, clearly trying to determine whether he was offering help out of obligation or genuine desire. Thomas met her gaze steadily, hoping she could see that his concern was real, not grudging. "Just until Joseph gets his truck fixed," she asked finally. "However long it makes sense." That afternoon, when Thomas drove home, he got his first real look at her living situation. Joseph lived in a small mobile home on the reservation, clean but cramped, with an elderly truck in the yard that had clearly seen better days. His own space was even more modest, a tiny apartment attached to the back of Joseph's place, barely large enough for a bed, a chair, and a small kitchenette. The contrast between his humble circumstances and the obvious pride she took in her appearance and work was striking. Her clothes were always clean and pressed, her manner professional and dignified, but Thomas could see now that maintaining that standard probably required considerable effort and sacrifice. During the drive back to the ranch, Thomas found himself reconsidering the terms of his employment. $15 an hour had seemed fair when he'd thought of her as someone who simply needed a job. Now, understanding more about her situation, he wondered if he should be paying more, offering additional benefits, finding ways to help without damaging sense of independence. That evening, he called to discuss the situation. His foreman, who had a talent for understanding people, offered perspective that Thomas hadn't considered. "Boss, you want to help her, I get that. But's got pride, and pride is sometimes all people have left when everything else gets taken away. You start throwing money at her or acting like she can't take care of herself, you might do more harm than good. So what do you suggest?" "Find ways to help that don't feel like charity. Give her more responsibility maybe, make her feel more valuable rather than more dependent." His advice made sense, but Thomas struggled with how to implement it. Was already handling her current duties perfectly, and the ranch wasn't large enough to justify creating additional work just to increase her paycheck. The answer came unexpectedly the next morning, when mentioned her concern about the condition of sewing room. "The quilts in there need proper care," she said as they shared breakfast. "Some of them are getting dusty, and that beautiful star pattern she was working on, the fabric is going to fade if it stays in direct sunlight much longer." Thomas had noticed the same issues but hadn't known how to address them. The quilts represented hours of time and creativity, but he lacked the knowledge to preserve them properly. "Do you know about quilt care?" he asked. "My grandmother taught me. Quilts were important in our family, not just for warmth, but for carrying stories, traditions. She showed me how to clean them safely, how to store them so they last." An idea began to form in Thomas's mind. Would you be willing to take care of quilts, the finished ones and the projects she left unfinished? looked surprised by the request. "You'd trust me with her work." "I can't think of anyone I'd trust more." The project gave work at the ranch new dimension and purpose. Over the following days, Thomas watched her carefully examine each of quilts, researching the best preservation methods, gently cleaning pieces that needed attention. She worked with the same quiet competence she brought to cooking, but there was something almost reverent in how she handled needlework. More importantly, the quilt preservation project allowed Thomas to increase responsibilities and hours without it feeling like charity. Would catalogs work, photograph the finished pieces for insurance purposes, and carefully store everything in ways that would protect it for years to come. But the project also created an unexpected intimacy between them. As worked with quilts, she learned about Thomas's wife through her choice of patterns, her use of color, the stories embedded in fabric and thread. And Thomas, watching handle these precious reminders of his marriage, felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. "She was thinking about when she started this one," observed one afternoon, examining a quilt designed with playful children's motifs. "The colors are so hopeful." Thomas nodded, remembering dreams of the family they'd never been able to have, the children who would have inherited her talent and warmth. "We tried for years to have kids, never worked out." "I'm sorry." "Would have been a wonderful mother. She had so much love to give." Continued working, her hands gentle on the delicate fabric. "Love doesn't disappear when people die, it just finds new ways to express itself." The comment stayed with Thomas throughout the day. That evening, as they shared dinner, he found himself talking about more freely than he had since her death. Listened with the same attentive respect she'd shown the quilts, understanding that these stories were precious and fragile, requiring careful handling. "She would have liked you," Thomas said as was preparing to leave. "Always said the best people were the ones who showed their caring through actions rather than words." "I would have liked to know her," replied simply. By the end of the 4th week, Thomas realized that had become more than just an employee who cooked his meals and cleaned his house. She had become a friend, a confidant, someone whose presence had transformed not just his daily routine, but his entire relationship with his own life. The changes weren't dramatic or obvious to outside observers. Thomas still lived alone in the same house, still worked the same ranch, still carried the grief of losing. But the crushing loneliness that had defined his existence for so long had lifted, replaced by something he hadn't dared to hope for again: companionship, understanding, and the quiet comfort of being known by someone who cared about his. For her part, seemed to have found something valuable as well. Her initial wariness had given way to a more relaxed confidence, and she spoke more freely about her own past, her hopes for Joseph's future, her satisfaction in work that felt meaningful rather than just necessary. One evening, as they lingered over coffee and read her mystery novel while Thomas reviewed breeding charts, Thomas realized that this was exactly what contentment looked like. Not the passionate happiness he'd shared with, but something calmer, more sustainable, the deep satisfaction of a life shared with someone who understood both the value of companionship and the necessity of solitude. He said, setting down his papers. She responded without looking up from her book. "Thank you. For what this time? For showing me that moving forward doesn't mean leaving the past behind." Marked her place in the book and looked at him with that warm, understanding smile that had become one of the best parts of his day. "You would have figured that out eventually, too. Sometimes it just takes longer when you're doing it alone." As Thomas walked to the door that night and watched Joseph's truck carry her home through the desert darkness, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 1 month. The reserved rancher who had hired a quiet Navajo woman to cook his meals had discovered something he thought he'd lost forever: the ability to trust, to connect, to find joy in simple daily interactions. Tomorrow would bring another day of shared meals, comfortable conversation, and the quiet pleasure of a life lived in the company of someone who understood both the importance of work and the value of friendship. And for the first time since death, tomorrow felt like something to anticipate rather than simply endure. The transformation had been subtle but profound, accomplished not through dramatic gestures or life-altering events, but through the accumulation of small kindnesses, shared meals, and the gradual recognition that healing didn't require forgetting, only the courage to remain open to unexpected gifts. Had given Thomas back his appetite for life, one carefully prepared meal at a time, and in doing so had shown him that his story was far from over. It was simply ready for a new chapter.